So, yes, Gloria. Oh, you have to unmute, Gloria.
I can understand God, God everywhere, but I don't understand God nowhere.
Ah, yeah. I wondered if somebody's going to pick up on those paradoxes before I said anything about them. So, okay, good. So, well, rather than me sort of trying to give you my perspective on it, what do you think it might mean that God is everywhere and God is nowhere?
That it's, well, that it's not about space, that it's not about time and space. It's got to be beyond. So when we talk about everywhere, we're talking about a physical reality.
I think that's exactly it.
Okay.
I think that's exactly it. Yeah. So another well, before I talk anymore, let me see if anyone else had something that they want to add to that. Or, okay. So yeah, another idea, another way of looking at it too, is we say, well, God is here, and yet not all of God is here. And so in a sense, God is not here. The allness of God is not here, right? You can't sort of locate, well, God is, in the temple in Jerusalem, or in the Vatican in Rome, or in my church, right? There's a sense in which God isn't there, right? Even though there's also a sense in which God is there, but God's not confined to that. Wilma.
God is everywhere and God is now here.
And God is now here. Okay. That's probably not what Philo was getting at, but I think that's a really good way to look at it. God is everywhere and God is now here.
What you think of him,
Yeah.
He's now here.
I like that. See what you did there? A little bit of wordplay. Yeah. I think that's a nice idea. Okay. So when you get the same sort of thing, you got these other paradoxes here, right? Which is really typical. And again, remember, nothing you can say about God is absolutely true, and yet we can experience God. So nothing we can say is absolutely true. And I suppose a corollary to that would be that anything that we could say about God could be relatively true. This could be absolutely true. So we find in mystical writings a lot of times these paradoxes. First one that Gloria pointed out, right? But what about ever at rest and ever in motion? What kind of sense can you make about that? Any thoughts?
Well, ever at rest is that sense of peace and silence, yet all that's happening around us, the seasons and the tides and so on is, it's not at rest then, but in motion.
Okay. So, and simultaneously, there's an aspect of God that is ever at rest, and there's an aspect of God that's ever in motion, right? So there's a sort of an idea, and one of the things with mystical language, and the reason they use these paradoxes is, again, that anything we can put into language is only sort of relatively true. And one might at the same time, for example, be able to experience the divine in a state at rest where nevertheless something is happening. So if we get, a lot of times the emphasis in mystical meditation is stillness, arriving in a place of stillness. Also ideas about emanation. So if you think about, just as a metaphor for this, we think about the sun. We can think of the sun as being at rest, and yet it's constantly, it's in one place, and yet it's constantly emanating heat and light. It's generating energy, even though it is itself in a kind of place of stillness, right? So that's again a sort of emanation idea about the nature of reality, everything emanating from the one. Okay, Diane.
And also our bodies are constantly in motion. Our lungs are breathing, our hearts are beating.
Right. Right. That's a good point. Yeah. So no matter how inward still we may be, it's a good thing that we're still breathing, blood circulating, that sort of thing in the body. The sense in which when we are even at most rest,
Yeah.
in a most rested state, there's still activity going on. There's still energy. So that's another sort of way of thinking about it. Someone else had their hand up. Okay, cool. So I want to make just a comment about that last statement. It's possible for soul to attain the superhuman ecstasy of the nous. Okay, so again, this kind of goes back to Plato and the idea. The nous was understood to be divine intelligence, the realm of divine ideas, the realm of, as he sometimes called them, the realm of perfect forms, as you find in Plato's teaching. And typically, these mystics would say, okay, there is, this is when we get into the idea of experiencing God. It is possible to attain a state of superhuman ecstasy by reaching sort of this emanation that is closest to the center of God beyond all things. So there's sort of an idea that there are the divine ideas and divine mind, as we might put it in Unity Metaphysics, and yet there's also something beyond that. And so for Philo, it's possible to enter into the realm of forms, as Plato put it, but he doesn't really say necessarily that one can, technically have the experience of mystical union with God. And the idea of a mystical union with God is, in a way, sort of beyond anything that a good Jewish boy would want to say, right? Because there's a sense in which in Judaism, God is always other somehow, right? And so as close as we may get to God, we cannot sort of be God. We cannot become the infinite in this context, right? When you get later into the mysticism of the Kabbalah and that sort of thing, I'm not as familiar with the Kabbalah, and so, but my sense is that there's at least a suggestion in the Kabbalistic teachings that one might experience ultimately a union with the infinite. But don't hold me to that, because that's something I'll have to look up later. So if anyone knows, certainly willing to hear that. Are any of you students of Kabbalah? That's sort of you. That's you really have to go into a specific school to understand or to get the teachings of the Kabbalah.
You know, Jim, when I was studying to be a licensed teacher, I had to give a message, as part of my skills demonstration seminar. And they gave me my topic 2 weeks ahead of time, and it was God is eternal and evolving. I've never forgotten it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That fits with the process theology.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. I'm familiar with that. I studied process metaphysics and process theology. The idea of God as eternal. One of the ideas there, by the way, I guess is a little off topic, but one of the ideas in process metaphysics is that God has these two sides, the eternal and the evolving, as you put it. The eternal nature of God is sometimes described as deficient in actuality. Okay? So pure potentiality, deficient in actuality. So the evolving part is God sort of actualizing the divine potential, something like that. So that's a sort of another interesting idea that actually could fit fairly nicely with some of these mystical emanation theories of the universe. So process theology is something that's it's possible to make it, to talk about in a way that's compatible with mysticism. Sometimes we have to just reinterpret terms, right? All right, so I think most people would probably agree that Jesus was a mystic. Well, I don't know about most people, but I think most Unity people would agree that Jesus was a mystic. And the Christian mystics themselves, one of the favorite recurring quotations from Jesus is this idea that the kingdom of God is within you.
Mm.
In most Christian mystical writings, sooner or later they'll quote that, right? Because that's what they're looking for. They're not a mystic isn't waiting for, generally speaking, isn't waiting for Jesus to come in the sky and bring the final judgment. A mystic is not waiting to die for the experience of God. A mystic is seeking that experience in the here and now and seeking it within them. And so this is a really key passage. This passage, or a very similar wording, is found also in the Gospel of Thomas.
Mhm.
So we find it in Luke. The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed. Okay, so that sort of tosses out the whole sort of interpretation of Christianity that are going to be signs, and when the final judgment comes, and we'll be able to see what those signs are, and that it's going to happen in a particular place. Well, that's what Jesus says. Look, they will not say, "Lo, here it is," or "there," right?
Mhm.
So it's not a place, right?
Mhm.
And it's not going to have signs. It's something that's already present. The kingdom of God is present tense within you, right? So that gives us a clear idea of a way to interpret what Jesus said, or at least what Jesus authentically said, from this perspective that everything he's really talking about is, when he talks about the kingdom of God, he's talking about something within us. And so it gives us a new light on what the parables that he told and the metaphors, what those might mean, right? What's happening with those. The second quote has become one of my new favorite quotes. It's a little, I guess you could say it's a little story. It's a little parable. It's found only in the Gospel of Thomas. However, many scholars are in agreement that this story originated with Jesus. It just didn't make it into any of the four canonical Gospels, right? And it may not have made it into those Gospels because the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't really understand what this saying meant, and therefore couldn't come up with the proper context to insert it into their story. When would Jesus say this? Why would he say it, right? So we look at this story. I left out a little, repetitive piece there, but this is basically it. Father's rule, or the Father's kingdom, is like a woman who was carrying a jar full of meal. While she was walking along a distant road, the handle of the jar broke, and the meal spilled behind her along the road. When she reached her house, she put the jar down and discovered it was empty. If we try to interpret Christianity as something that has to do with an afterlife or a future event, this parable is really difficult to put into that context, put into that interpretive frame. But it's easy to put into the mystical interpretive frame, because the mystics are always talking about letting go of attachments, achieving emptiness. They talk about God is emptiness, or God is nothing, as we'll see. And so in that sense, we can see this parable as being about the soul actually letting go of its burdens.
Mm.
And that's what the kingdom of God is like. It's emptying ourselves of our attachments, our burdens, maybe our false ideas, whatever you put into the jar of the soul that is weighing you down as you go along the road. And the emptying is a sort of gradual thing that takes place. We might not even notice what's happening as it's going on, but eventually achieving that space of emptiness, of extinction. They call it extinction. The word nirvana means extinction in Buddhism, but also the Sufi mystics, when we get to them, we'll see that they have that same idea of extinction. And what they're talking about is attaining this state of not distinguishing yourself, not separating yourself or anything else from the divine. Maya, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
No,
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. I saw your thing was you were unmuted. So.
I guess waving at something. I don't know what.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, let's move on. So I wanted to sort of introduce that. We could obviously you can spend, hours and hours contemplating the teachings of Jesus and interpreting them in this light. But I want to, include him in this stream of our mystics. And another one who's in Christian thought is always considered to be a mystic in some sense is Paul. Okay? And a lot of the sayings of Paul also show up in the writings of Christian mystics. So the first quotation here, and see Paul's dates are like 5 to 67. So again, he's contemporary with Jesus, but he didn't ever actually know the historical Jesus. In his letter to the Galatians, there's a passage that we find where he's talking about his own experience. And he says, "He who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his son in me." And this this translation is almost never used in English translations. They substitute the word "to" for the word "in." And why do they do that? Well, the actual Greek there is the preposition en, which means in or within. It doesn't mean to, right? Or it's hardly ever used to mean that. So why do they tweak that and use an unusual translation? Well, the idea of revealing his son to me fits nicely with the way the story of Paul is told in the book of Acts, where he has this vision and Jesus appears and he knocks him off his horse and talks to him as sort of other being. That fits with he revealed his son to me. But what Paul actually wrote was his son in me. So he's talking about an inner experience. And he makes reference to that all throughout his letters, where he talks about Christ in me, Christ in you, right? So he always places, again, the Christ as an inner experience rather than an outer vision. So I believe that, the theology of the translators of the scriptures sort of put them in a position, well, "to" is a better translation here because it fits the story better, but it's not a better translation in the sense of the way Greek is usually translated, right? "En" is almost always interpreted as "in" and to indicate something within. So it's an inner experience. And then in another place, Corinthians, one of the letters to the Corinthians, he describes an experience that he had, but he describes it in third person. Okay. So when he says, "I know that this man was caught up into paradise," he's not talking about another person that he knows. He's talking about himself. He's putting it in third person to remain modest. He precedes this saying with talking about, "I don't want to boast, but you forced me to boast." So he's trying to be modest here by talking about it as if it was in third person. And people will still sometimes do that. They'll refer to themselves by their name, for example, in third person. And it's an old school. In Kansas, we had a senator, Bob Dole, who ran for president, actually, and was Bob Dole often referred to himself that way. Instead of saying "I," he would say, "Well, Bob Dole doesn't say those kinds of things, right? Doesn't do those kinds of things." So he'd refer to himself in third person. Well, that's kind of what Paul is doing here. It's sort of a strategy to remain, to not be sounding too boastful. So he says, "I know this man was caught up in paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter." In this little description of his experience, Paul touches on a couple of things that are part of a mystical perspective, or the mystical descriptions of the mystical experience. It's non-physical. He doesn't know if he's in his body or out of it, right? So in this experience, he's not experiencing his body. And he hears things that cannot be told, right? So again, it's sort of the idea of this experience ultimately is indescribable, cannot be told, cannot be put into language. It's not possible for him to say what he experienced. So again, this indicates that Paul also had a mystical experience, and this passage, this one about the experience in paradise, is also a very important and repeated passage in the writings of Christian mystics when they're talking about what their experiences are. So Paul is also frequently quoted in that stream of thought. This is just about the experience. Okay. So, next mystic that I want to talk about is a Christian mystic. He's a Christian philosopher, theologian, the first teacher to start an actual Christian school or college, right? A formal organized college. And he started it in Alexandria, Egypt. Again, he's from Egypt, like Philo. In fact, undoubtedly was a reader of Philo, and consequently his origins perspective was, I'm pretty sure, influenced by Philo and the other sort of Platonist philosophers that he would have studied in Alexandria, the home of the world's largest library at that time. So, but we see Origen also, like Philo, does the metaphysical Bible interpretation, as we call it, interprets scriptures allegorically. Origen's interpretation of the creation story is very similar to the way Charles Fillmore interpreted. Origen recognized that the story could not be accepted as sort of literally true. Right? One thing he saw that couldn't be literally true is how could you have plants before you had the sun? Right? The creation story in its sort of literal sense, the plants are created and then the sun comes out. Well, Origen's aware of the science, to at least to some degree, of the science of plants and growing, and he knows that plants need sunlight, and therefore there couldn't have been plants before the sun in any sort of literal way. So if we can't take it literally, and he sees that in other places in the scriptures, we can't take these things all literally, but there must be some other deeper meaning. And so Origen had a theory of the threefold interpretation of scriptures, the three ways to read the scriptures. One, the literal level is like the body, okay? The body doesn't exist for the sake of the soul. The soul doesn't exist for the sake of the body, but the body exists for the sake of the soul. So the body, the literal part, is not the most important one. So it can have errors in order to communicate the next levels or the other two levels. One of the levels is the moral level, and the other one is the celestial or spiritual level. So we're actually familiar with everybody's familiar with literal and moral interpretation, right? So literal, you tell the story as if it's fact. This sort of way wise preachers will treat Bible stories. But the moral is the lesson. What's the lesson to be derived? The life lesson to be derived from this or that story, right? Or what is the morality that's expressed by it? That's the soul interpretation. There's body interpretation, which is the literal. The soul, the body is for the sake of the soul, but there's even a deeper level, the spiritual or celestial level. And so just as humans were understood in those times to have these three phases of being, spirit, soul, and body. So the Bible for Origen also had to have those three levels. So the spiritual level is usually what we mean when we talk about metaphysical interpretation. It has to do with with deep spiritual truths, with the evolution of the soul in its divinity, right? So Origen goes at the scripture in that way, and the conclusions that he draws from his philosophical reflections and his scriptural reflections, he arrives at descriptions or ways of talking about God that very much fit into the mystical stream. See this first quotation: God is incomprehensible and incapable of being measured. So there is more to God than we can compact, as Emily Cady said, into the quart container of our intellect, or something like, she said something like that, right? God is more than we can capture with language. God is more than any sort of finite concepts that we may have, okay? God, therefore, is not to be thought of as a being, either as a being, either a body or as existing in a body, but as in an uncompounded intellectual nature. Okay, well, that's his way of saying God is mind, but God doesn't have a body. Okay. This saying would have certainly been startling to Michelangelo, because Michelangelo, painting the Vatican Sealing thought of God as an old man. And I think that's the way a lot of people think about God, as sort of this, this Superman, but also very old, because, ancient of days kind of thing. So he said, no, Origen sort of rejects the whole notion of God as having a form or having a body, and thinks of God more as as he calls it, intellectual here, or mind nature. That's what he's getting at. And finally, this final point, now I myself think that when it is said that God is all in all, it means that he is also all things in each individual person. So if God is all things in each individual person, what does that suggest to you about yourself? God is all in all. God is all things in you. We'll personalize it. What does that
I'm an
mean to you?
expression of God. Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry, was that Brendan? I didn't see you say.
Yeah, I am an expression of God. And so
Mhm.
I express God differently than anyone else does.
Okay, yes. What else? Other thoughts?
Yeah.
I suppose that gets at it in a, sort of the most precise way. Wilma, did you have something?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, so one of the things that I thought about is so that means God is all things in each individual person. That means that in some way, all of my desires are God in me,
Mhm.
even the ones maybe that we might judge as not being so good if we're confused by the right and wrong kind of thing. But that's, in some sense, a God in me. My various organs, my heart, my lungs, my kidneys, right, my intestines, right, all of that is God in me too. So
Yeah.
whether you talk about every atom, every cell is God in me, every part of my consciousness is God in me. It's not the allness of God. It may not be the highest expression of the divine possibilities in me, but nevertheless, its very sort of existence or reality is in some way, as Brendan put it very distinctly, everything is a manifestation of God. Everything. And I
Even
think
the
that,
seemingly negative stuff, right?
yes, yeah, it's sort of
That's
like,
what I had a hard time of, when I first learned this concept, it was like, wait a minute.
how can that be? How can that be? Right? So,
Mhm.
yeah, and so that's a thing that we maybe need to struggle with within ourselves, to understand how can that possibly be, that everything in me and everything in every other person I see is God. Okay, not in some sort of abstract sense, but in reality. Okay? And so maybe a clue to this, I'll just throw it out there, is that in reality it's God, and yet we are susceptible to having limited or incorrect or illusionary interpretations of things. And so maybe when I say all of my desires are God's desire in me, that is true in as they say in metaphysics, right, in an ontological sense, in the sense of its beingness or its substance or whatever. It's true, and at the same time, it could be uh, as I'm perceiving those desires or I'm having those desires, I haven't interpreted them in the fullest light of truth, right? Or if I'm looking at my body and I'm saying, like Myrtle Fillmore talked to her body, she had been sending it limited thoughts, and so she asked its forgiveness and began to affirm the fuller truth of the divinity, the divine life in each part of her body, right? And so I think this is a part of what um, Origen was getting at. Origen believed that ultimately everyone would attain the same, I'm going to use Unity language, the same consciousness of Christ that Jesus had. Everyone, every soul ultimately will attain that. And in order for that to happen, he believed in what they used to call metamorphosis, what we usually call reincarnation. The soul may have to go through many incarnations in order to attain this state, but everyone would, and therefore everyone would, in Christian terminology, everyone would be saved. Ultimately, everyone would be saved, but it might be a multiple lifetime kind of process. That was one of the reasons that that idea of second, third, or however many chances we need to evolve, that may be one of the reasons that the church eventually rejected Origen's teachings. They didn't like his ideas about universal salvation and reincarnation, so they basically said, well, you know, Origen's a heretic or whatever. But that was actually several hundred years after he lived, so it didn't affect him in his lifetime. But in that time, a lot of Origen's other ideas about the nature of the Christ and so on entered into Christian teachings. So he had an influence, even though not all of his ideas took hold in Christianity. A lot of them did or were reinterpreted. So we've gone from China and India to Middle East. Where are we going next? Into the second millennium. No, we're moving into the second millennium. Okay. So I gave a talk a while ago in Montreal about Plotinus, right? Or I brought him into the discussion, and I've got a picture here. So you might, if you heard that talk, you might, you probably don't recall. I don't remember everything I heard several months ago, so I don't necessarily expect you to remember. But he was a mystic who had an influential mystic who had significant impact on how later mystics understood the universe in sort of metaphysical terms. So this diagram shows that emanation theory. So at the center, at the core, at the ultimate level of all things, there is just the one. And the one is higher than anything else, and so on, as we'll see. The next thing that emanates from the one is what he calls the intellectual, what here on the diagram says intellectual principle. Again, this is the nous. Remember nous, the mind, the level of that Philo said one could experience ecstasy in this level. Plato called it the realm of forms. Okay, so, or we might call it the realm of divine ideas. So divine ideas emanate from the one, just in a sense as light emanates from the sun. That's a way of thinking about it, right? And then the next level was soul. Okay, so we have these ideas, and now what emanates from that is the ability, one might say, to perceive the ideas. So soul is kind of the realm of perception and motion. So the one and the intellect and the mind, or the realm of ideas, is thought to be at rest, if you will. And now we get to but then they emanate the soul. The soul. It's sort of the idea here of an emanation of a dimension that wants to experience the divine ideas, but also wants to externalize them into forms, including the body, but the forms of nature. And so for Plotinus, this is sort of the ultimate. So what we call the external world, or what we call nature, is actually the sort of the aspect of this field of emanations that is the least like the one, that is farthest from the one. And so for Plotinus, and again, here he's kind of following Plato, what we want to do in order to experience the one is we want to contemplate nature in a way that leads us beyond the forms into the ideas behind the forms, behind the things that we perceive external to ourselves. We want to perceive them at the level of soul. You know, what does this mean at the level of soul? And then ultimately at the level of the divine ideas, and then ultimately the experience of the divine one, what's commonly called the mystical experience. So that's sort of Plotinus's metaphysics, if you will, but it also tells you sort of what's his mysticism. His mysticism, very similar to Plato, is the contemplation of the divine ideas, first as we perceive them in nature, but then as we perceive them in soul. So we can say, the example that's usually given is beauty. We could see beauty all around us in nature, right? See beauty in form. But what is the beautiful soul? What are the qualities of soul that make a soul beautiful? We can perceive that. And then ultimately, in contemplating that, we may arrive at the original idea of beauty, for example. So that's, and we said the same thing with justice and love and so on. So that's Plotinus's theory in a nutshell. Here's some quotations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically it describes this idea of the emanation. The nature of the one produces all things, and it is none of them. So there's that idea again of transcendence, but nevertheless everything is generated or emanates from. So it's not separate. We must think of this emanation as like the heat and the light emanating from the sun. It's not separate from the sun. It's a manifestation or an expression or an emanation of the one. Okay. The first is perfect, the most perfect of all. That's the one, the primal power. And the other powers attempt to imitate that. So there's sort of Platonic language of the natural world. What we call the natural world is really just an imitation of ultimate reality, of true ideas. And so, let's see if there's anything else. Okay, so there's this quotation that used the sun analogy. What do we think of as surrounding the one in its repose? There's the divine at rest. It must be a radiation from it while it remains unchanged, just like the bright light which surrounds the sun, which remains unchanged, though light springs from it continually. One is always perfect, therefore produces everlastingly, and so on. So each emanation is somewhat less than what came before it. And the whole idea of the Neoplatonic mysticism is to return to the one, return to the realm of the perfection, the realm of truth. Okay. So I'm not going to do these. This is just kind of more description of, the nous, the intellectual principle, the mind, whatever is second to the one, and so on. Notice the sort of the last quotation on the slide. Shut your eyes and change to and wake another way of seeing, which everyone has but few use. So this idea of shutting your eyes is not, it is sort of literally shutting your eyes, but it's, again, as we see in mysticism, the idea of turning our attention away from the outer and moving it inward, as he describes it here, is waking to another way of seeing. In a sense, I don't usually think of it this way, but in a sense, science does something like that. Because what science does, okay, it looks at the world, it makes observations about it, but then the scientist goes inward and thinks about, now what can I conclude? What can I infer from that which I can observe? What can I infer from maybe experiments that I perform? So Einstein, for example, or Newton, didn't really get their ideas from looking outward at the world. They got their ideas from turning inward in thought experiments, as they're sometimes called in science. So even in science, there's sort of this shutting your eyes to the outer and turning inward as a new way of seeing. And here, of course, he's talking about it in a spiritual context. So now, any questions about the whole sort of Neoplatonic approach? Because this is really basic to, especially to Western mysticism, but you also see it in Eastern. Thoughts, comments? I want to also kind of keep track of how I'm doing on time here. Okay. Oh, so yeah, we still have a little time, which is good. So I want to now we're going to move to the Eastern Orthodox, which now we're getting like Greece, right? Moving into Europe, Eastern Europe, Turkey, and that sort of thing. So we're shifting, and one of the famous early mystics of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Gregory of Nyssa. So just a couple of quotes from him that are suggestive. When one considers the universe, can anyone be so simple-minded as not to believe that divine is present in everything, pervading, embracing, penetrating? So here you have very early Christianity, near the time of Constantine and the whole imperial takeover of the church and religion, but you still have, in this era, you have these mystics who do not think of God as being somewhere else or outside of the universe, but rather think of the divine, and as Gregory puts it, in everything, pervading, embracing, penetrating. And then when he talks about, contemplation, contemplation of God, the prayer, the life of prayer, he says, what do we do? Well, we do this that we may merge into the deep and dazzling darkness. There's one of those wonderful paradoxical sorts of statements that mystics use. Dazzling darkness. You usually think of the darkness as dazzling. We usually think of light as dazzling, right? So it's a dazzling darkness. And then what? Vanish into it. Dissolve in it forever in an unbelievable bliss beyond imagination. So it's so, this is a bliss that we cannot imagine from our earthly experiences. And then he says this, absolute nothingness represents absolute bliss. Now there, if ever I saw one, is a statement about the nature of the mystical experience, where the self, the soul, the consciousness, all our thinking, feeling, our sense of having a body and separate from the universe, all of that dissipates. And yet what remains is sort of this consciousness of bliss, even though we're not conscious of anything in particular in the usual way. So what do you think about that? I love that phrase, dazzling darkness, but what do you think about that? Is that anything that you've ever considered and think about what is God? What would the experience of God be like? Any thoughts on that? If Brendan, if you're talking, you're muted. So.
Oh, okay. I'm studying unified mindfulness, and this is, and it's includes a tome that they're putting together. I call it a tome. It's over 700 pages now, really trying to describe and distinguish mystical experiences which aren't supposed to be describable. But anyway, I love this, just fits beautifully into it.
Yeah, it's something that is, maybe we can imagine a little bit what a dazzling darkness might be, but it's sort of a typical paradoxical sounding thing, because again, the nothing we could say is absolutely true. And so if you can combine seemingly opposite ideas, then that's a way of not really fully describing the divine nature, but saying something important about it, maybe is a way of putting it.
Yeah, I think to me, the dazzling darkness would be like going into outer space. That would to me be dazzling darkness.
Like my background.
Yeah.
Maya?
Well, I'm interested in what some of the Christian mystics talk about, the darkness, the dark night of the soul as being part of the mystical experience. And yes, it sounds like it might be a very, maybe even a negative experience, but the mystics, the Christian mystics, really call that as a very essential part of coming to an experience with God, is to embrace the darkness that can be part of not knowing, not being all lit up with understanding, but being befuddled, being and I see that dazzling darkness as something that when I go into it, when I'm accepting it, when I'm not trying to push it away, when I'm not trying to fix it, when I see that God is in there, this concept of it, that it dazzles me, reminds me to total and utter surprise that I can find the presence in my darkness.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we'll actually, that idea of the dark night of the soul, I think, comes from St. John of the Cross.
Right,
So
right.
we will get to him in the third millennium. So we can bring that idea bring the darkness back to the light when we get to St. John of the Cross. But yeah, so this is I find it interesting to read some of these mystics, because so often what I hear in sort of conventional religious language is, oh, God is the light. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and God enlightens it. And so everything's about light, light, light. And what the mystics say basically is, well, in a way, light is secondary to the darkness, because the light comes out of the darkness. Or that's they sometimes talk about it that way. And you can, and what you said, Maya, is like a great understanding of how that applies in our everyday experience, that we can be going through some kind of darkness, as you put it, not knowing where to go or not understanding why things are happening, and suddenly get that, from that, a spontaneous illumination, right? Spontaneous illumination that dazzles us, as you put it there. So out of the darkness comes the light. And so a lot of times mystics will use that sort of language. It's appropriate because, again, they're trying to talk about something that isn't, they're talking about, I'm going to say, a dimension of the divine that isn't ordinarily part of our everyday experience, unless we sort of pursue it, or unless it sort of suddenly comes upon us. So let's see who else we got here. Okay, let's see. So this is from another Eastern Orthodox mystic. And this is a typical mystic attitude. It says, and this is, okay, so this quotation obviously is out of context, as all of these are, but basically Cassian's talking about the importance of meditation. And then he concludes, you see then that the Lord makes the chief good consist in meditation, i.e., that is, in divine contemplation. Okay? And so, again, a lot of times we think, well, in order to attain the good, we must act for the good, that we always associate goodness with doing something, acting. And here he's saying, well, you're doing something, but it's the contemplation of the divine. How do we do that? The contemplation of God is gained in a variety of ways, by admiring his incomprehensible essence through the greatness of his creation or the vastness of his knowledge. So Cassian's getting at this idea of not prayer, not as like asking God for things, but prayer as contemplating what God is, or what God could be, or our best to think about things like the essence of God, which is beyond our comprehension, and how that in itself is admirable, right? That in itself might inspire what Einstein called cosmic religious feeling, just sort of sense of wonder at it all, right? We might contemplate creation. We might contemplate the idea of God's all-knowingness and so on. So this is, again, sort of typical mystic talk. And here I brought it up because of his focus on the idea of contemplation as the way, right? The way to that experience. Okay. So here's this, I'm going to share a few more from one of the ideas that you have in Eastern Orthodoxy is the deification of the creature. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's a little bit different than in Catholicism or even Protestantism, there's an idea that we are to become more and more divine, or more and more like the divine, and that's a goal and a purpose, I guess you would say, of Christianity, right? And so we find Maximus, Saint Maximus, one of the Eastern Orthodox. This alone about him is universally intelligible, his infinitude. And to know this nothing is to pass beyond the knowledge of the thinking mind. I'm going to stop there for a second and see can you make any sense out of the idea of God as being both infinite and nothing? Is there a way that you can explain that or make sense out of that? Or is that something that in some way you feel to be true, even if you can't exactly say why. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? It's okay if you don't, I'm just checking. Okay. Okay. I think to me, when you think about infinity, I like to think of this in terms of numbers, really. The number, we talk about infinite number or infinity in mathematics, and the number 0, which represents nothing, actually have a lot in common, right? If you multiply any number by infinity, infinity remains unchanged. It's still infinity, right? If you multiply any number by 0,
Get 0.
the product is 0. 0 and infinity both turn everything into themselves mathematically, if you put it that way. So I find that sort of, okay, so we can't really say what infinity is because it doesn't have any endpoint. We can't comprehend that. The same way we can't really comprehend what nothingness is. As we try to imagine nothing, we're still aware that it's we who are trying to imagine nothing. We're still, sort of stuck in a situation where we can't quite imagine what nothing is, just as we cannot quite imagine what infinity is. So I sort of like that aspect of mystical talk where God can be nothing and God can be the infinite, and there's nothing contradictory in that, even though it seems paradoxical. Okay. Let's see. Can't leave without at least mentioning St. Augustine of Hippo, again, another African mystic, right? He says, and Augustine in his Confessions talks about his search for God, and he's looking for God, and he does it in a very Platonic way. He first looks around in the world and sees all the wonders and the beauty in the world, but I do not find God there, right? So that doesn't get him at it. So he goes to the next level. He searches within his own mind and discovers, okay, in a sense, God is in my memory. And so he keeps going inward. Okay. And then he sort of ends up here. I entered even into my inward self, thou being my guide. So again, he's talking to God, sort of thing. I entered and beheld with the eye of my soul the light unchangeable, not this ordinary light, which all flesh may look upon, nor, sorry, that's a misprint, may look upon, nor as it were a greater of the same kind. So it's not the kind of light we see, or even something that's like light, a greater kind. Not such was this light, but other, yea, far other from all these. So again, Augustine finds himself having an experience that he can't quite describe. It's a light, it's unchangeable, but it's not really like ordinary light. And so the thing about Augustine is just this notion of inward contemplation in order to know or to experience, to understand God in some way. So that's sort of the Western strand of mysticism that's found in Augustine as an influential theologian. Right. And I come now to my favorite mystic. I'm going to sort of stop with this quotation. Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius the Areopagite is written about as a convert of Paul in the book of Acts, and that's about all we know about him. And in sometime around the 5th century, an anonymous mystic wrote these teachings down and attributed them to this practically unknown character, Dionysius, right? And for a long time, this book was very popular for a long time, very influential, and for a long time, everyone assumed that it actually was written by Dionysius. So it wasn't until they got into later eras of literary criticism where they realized, okay, that can't be from that era. It's got to be more from like the 5th century. So we've got an anonymous mystic referring to another anonymous mystic from a relatively anonymous mystic from the Bible. So, and it seems appropriate to me. So we'll just kind of look at this one quotation. I might show you some others next time. But what's this process of contemplation to attain the divine union? Leave behind the senses and the operations of the intellect. and all things sensible and intellectual, and all things in the world of being and non-being, that thou mayest arise by unknowing towards the union, as far as it is attainable, with him who transcends all being and all knowledge. For by the unceasing and absolute renunciation of thyself and of all things, thou mayest be borne on high through pure and entire self-abnegation into the superessential radiance of the divine darkness. Well, that's a lot of words, right? What is he ultimately getting at here, do you think? If someone were to come to you as a spiritual teacher and say, I found this quotation from this mystic guy, does this make any sense to you? What could he possibly be talking about here? How would you try to interpret that for someone who's trying to understand what he's saying here? Go ahead, I'll leave it up here. You can read it, think about it for a few seconds.
Well, it sounds to me like he's saying, you've got to get out of your head and experience totally surrender to this unknown or to the absolute.
Okay, yeah, sure. That's a good way of explaining it.
Mhm.
What else do you see there? In a way, I kind of think of this as a sort of review of what we've been talking about.
So to me, I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
No, go ahead.
To me, it's sort of like what we talk about today when we go into meditation, where we, as Brenda said, surrender to our outside senses, go into meditation and, go deeper into ourselves.
Yeah, yes, it is. It's going deeper into the self because the kingdom of God is within, right? But moving beyond the things that we might perceive as being outside of the body or the body itself, even, right? Even beyond our concepts, usual ways of understanding things. Of course, he uses the divine dark, not the dazzling darkness, but the divine darkness. Okay? It's a place, not a place of knowing, but of unknowing, which is interesting that you find this here, I think, especially in the Christian strand, but also, to some degree, the Buddhist and Taoist strands of what I would call mystical thought. You have this this idea of becoming nothing, that you may merge with the all. This inwardness. It's pretty interesting that they all sort of kind of get at that, getting beyond the intellect. And one of the interesting things about it to me is that we often say God is omniscience, right? God is all-knowing. And yet some of these mystics are saying you're actually, in merging with the divine, you're actually getting beyond knowing. Even though God is all-knowing, you would think that if you have an experience of merging with, the divine mind, and the mind, not vine, knows everything, then wouldn't that mean that I would then be also knowing everything rather than not knowing? I could leave you with that paradox. Seeming paradox. Just let you reflect on that. What I'd like to do, I realize I'm running a little over time. I apologize for that, because while I'm looking at my screen, I don't have a. But what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is just take a couple more minutes to do a brief meditation using some of these ideas. So, and if you have to leave, I will not be insulted. Right? I won't take it personally. Okay. So, if God within, let's turn. If God is within, let's turn inward. Close your eyes. Find a new way of waking to a new way of seeing. invite you to think of this idea of God as omnipresence, God as everywhere. To think of it, but to try to open to what that means to you experientially. The idea of feeling God everywhere. And then open to the idea of God as nowhere. It's everywhere and nowhere. All these thoughts, not to understand them intellectually, but open to feeling, experiential sense. God is everywhere and God is nowhere. God is omniscience, all-knowing. Your mind to the notion of infinite knowing, all-knowing, then to the idea that God is beyond knowing, beyond our ways of knowing. God is omnipotence, all power. And yet, because one is all and all is in one, is not power over anything. So God is beyond power. God is all power and beyond power. God is good. God is absolute good. God is beyond the duality of good and evil, beyond the duality of right and wrong and self and other. God is being. God is beyond being. God is all in all. And God is beyond all. The infinite and nothing. We allow these seeming paradoxes to have their way in us to stretch our consciousness, to stretch our experience, to open us more and more to the merging, consciously merging with the one. Close with a few moments of stillness and silence. Now we return to our awareness of our bodies and the world around us, but with a new way of seeing, perhaps a new way of being. We return with perhaps a sense of peace, bliss, or all-encompassing love. Return with an openness to new ways of seeing and new ways of being. For that openness, that limitless openness, our hearts are filled with joy and gratitude. So it is. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Hope you all be back next
Namaste,
week.
everyone.
Yes, yes. Put it on your calendar next week at the
Yes.
same time.
Meet some more interesting mystics with some more interesting ideas.
Yeah.
You know, I would love to see which one of the key ideas of the various mystics have made it into unity.
How did that happen?
Not now, but
Yeah.
Mr. Fillmore obviously read extensively and he picked what he wanted to be part of his understanding, right?
Yeah. That would be sort of a whole interesting topic to itself. What were the sort of the most influential writings on his development of his thought? Yeah. I would like to do that too sometime.
Yeah.
All right.
Namaste. Have a wonderful evening, all of you.
Everyone have a
Bye.
wonderful week. Bye now.
James, you're speaking this Sunday.
Yes, I've been working on what it is I want to talk about and how I want. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. How I want to describe it.
Right.
So I've actually been working on that kind of all day, and I'm not quite settled, but I hope to have it all settled and send it off to you tomorrow morning.
All right.
As far as the description, but I am going to do something about related to Valentine's Day.
Okay.
That much I can tell you.
Very good. Okay.
All right. See you then.
See you Sunday. Yes.
Yes. Okay.